So anyway, let me note first, we're shifting gears. So we've been doing health, and now we're going to be doing environment stuff, salmon, water delivery, etc. And so let me just make a couple comments about that for people who aren't familiar with the water issues. And Tom Ring is going to, sitting over here, is going to start by just laying out in 5 minutes what the water basin looks like, so you can see the water distribution issues that are at work. And if you came over, if you're not from here and you drove over I-90 on the way down to Yakima and you saw the water lakes and stuff on your right, you were seeing part of the water network coming down here. So what we're going to do on this panel is a bit different. We're not going to give you a lot of data on water conditions and such. We're going to have a roundtable on collaborative process. So we're going to focus on what the collaborative process looked like in general, how people's thinking might have changed due to the collaborative processes that were used, how they felt about their participation, perhaps the use of science, whatever. I'm going to be asking a series of questions in this regard. And my last question will be to all the panelists, is the integrated water plan better because of the collaborative process, or could a better outcome have been achieved in other ways? We can always look at a collaborative process and say, yeah, it could have been better, but that's not good enough. Could there have been something better because the process looked different? So what can we learn from this very large effort to deal with water shortages, climate change, fish habitat, et cetera, in the Yakima Basin, as well as continued water to agriculture, which is super important, in the presence of Western water rights, which are highly contentious. There's a lot going on, and our participants will be talking about that. Let me first say who I am, Craig Thomas. I've been doing research on collaborative governance since the late 80s, and wrote my dissertation under Bruce Kane, although he was not doing collaborative governance then. He was doing stuff on political regulation, and somehow he thought my stuff was interesting enough to read. And now he's come into the fold. He's into collaborative governance. So I do research on this. I'm at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. I'll be on the next panel about university-based collaborative consortia. And I am not a specialist by any means on things east of the mountains. Like many people in the West, I study all my stuff is in Puget Sound, it's salty, it's forests, et cetera. So this is a learning experience for me. So I'm going to follow their lead on what's important to talk about. And we'll be opening it to Q&A, obviously. I also just want to give a shout out to Dan Evans, who our school is named after. He's still alive, I shouldn't say he was. He's a Republican, but he comes from an era in which Republicans and Democrats collaborated. They really got along. And we changed the name of our school from Public Affairs, who knows what that means, to Public Policy and Governance. And we picked the word governance for exactly the reason Bruce noted, that it's not just about government. It's about the nonprofit sector. We're actually ranked number 5, according to the U.S. News and World Report rankings that just came out last week, or this week. In nonprofit, which is about 1/3 of our students. We do a lot of social entrepreneurship stuff. So governance is the big thing now. It's not just the public sector. And it's great to have our school named after Dan Evans, because he's long been a leader in collaborative ways of doing business in the legislature and in the his governorship. He actually left the Senate, he said, back in the 80s or 90s or whenever it was, because they couldn't get anything done. And that was back when people got along. So apparently you get more done at the state level. So what I'm going to ask the panelists, Tom will start by giving a brief overview of what the situation looks like. And then my questions are going to be straightforward. There's 2 things that political scientists like me care about. One is the difference between positions and beliefs. So people stake positions based upon the interest, what they want, but there's a lot of things that go on in our mind that have to do with beliefs. Do you believe that climate change is occurring? Do you believe it's human caused? Do you believe salmon are in trouble? Do you believe we should care about that, et cetera? And one of the things that collaboration is touted for is the ability for people to deliberate, to learn about each other, to discuss the quality of data, being open-minded, coming to new beliefs perhaps, and therefore being able to resolve long-term disputes over what we call wicked problems. So wicked problems are typically defined as where people disagree on both what the problems are, climate change, snowpack, not a problem, as well as the solutions to the problems. And so wicked problems have both, and you have to resolve both of them. And beliefs are super important because they're undergirding how you think about your own positions and your own interests from those positions. And so one of the questions I'm going to ask is, in what ways did the collaborative process change your positions? You came in wanting certain things based upon certain interests. We all understand that. It's what we negotiate about. But more importantly, did the collaborative process change your beliefs? Was there something going on that led you to believe that the situations were different, to believe that other people weren't antagonistic, to believe whatever? And one of the things collaboration is touted for is changing beliefs. You know, changing positions and interests, you can get lawyers and negotiators on that. But collaboration takes more time, it's deliberative, you have to come in open-minded. And so I'll be asking about that, and if you did change your beliefs, how did they change and why? Was it based upon science, getting to know people, trusting them more, maybe other things? And then the last question, I really only have 3 questions, changing positions, changing beliefs, and is the, if you're not satisfied with this outcome, what venue could this have been in, or what collaborative process redesign might have produced a better outcome? And not just for you, that's, you know, we all want something better because we like it, but for society, for the Yakima Basin, for people, for growers, for salmon fishers, et cetera. So what we'll start with is Tom is going to give us a 5-minute overview of the big picture of what's going on, and then I'll start asking questions, and probably just keep it open for Q&A as we go through so you don't have to wait since this is a round table.
Sort of a round table.
Yeah, more linear.
It's a couch, get along.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here. I am Tom Ring. I'm a hydrogeologist with the Yakima Nation. I've worked there for 27 years now. It's interesting that you would start with Dan Evans' discussion, because one of the things that he could not get done and tried hard and nobly was a big fix for the Yakima Basin. And really the last thing he worked on in the Senate was trying to pull all the parties together to agree on the big fix for the basin. And that wasn't able to get done, and he left the Senate shortly after that. Now, when I was asked to think about how we got here, it would be very strange to those of you who'd been around for a while to see a picture of this gentleman, Ron Van Gundy, taken by me on the cover of Irrigation Leader magazine. He passed away last year, and this is a memorial of him. We were not friends initially. Would you call it a wicked problem? I think he was kind of a wicked problem in my life early on in my career. And he was ultimately instrumental in bridging the void between the tribe and the irrigators who had been at loggerheads. You know, we've been in an adjudication process for 40 years in this basin, and if you don't know about adjudications, it's where the state sues everybody in the basin who claims to have a right to use water, and so everybody gets to disagree. As my joke is, I wouldn't wish the adjudication process on my worst enemy, but all my worst enemies are already in the adjudication, so it doesn't matter. Former enemies, that's right. Erstwhile enemies. Okay, so let's see if I can do this now. That's my clicker, my human clicker. Just wanted to give you a quick map view of the Yakima Basin, so it's not totally abstract. These are the 7 components of the Yakima Integrated Plan, which I'm not going to go into in detail. I will. So the big problems, I'm looking at the right one. The big problems in the Yakima Basin, from my perspective and from the perspective of the tribe, involve the impacts to tribal resources of irrigated agriculture, by and large. And this is the picture that I stole and adapted from Bob Tuck's master's thesis. Red is the universal color of ecological distress in this particular map. The red areas on the, let's see, for you, on the left side of the picture are the reservoirs and the habitat above the reservoirs that were built by the Bureau of Reclamation in the early 20th century. They completely blocked all fish passage into the upper watershed, and with the completion of Bumping Dam in 1910, that eliminated the sockeye salmon run completely in the Yakima Basin. So a resource that the tribal folks had relied on for 700 generations, give or take, disappeared in 1910. Also, if those dark red areas are the heart, then the purple areas are probably the lungs of the basin. Those are the tributaries that were extremely important for coho and other salmon and Chinook salmon that used them to rear and spawn in. Those were also virtually completely blocked off by smaller irrigation diversion dams and dewatered by irrigation diversions. And Urban's going to want me to point out that in the center where you see the word Ellensburg, there is a creek coming in from the left that is Monastash Creek. And yes, I'm not going to go all the way through this, but perhaps later we can cycle through and show the change that has happened in Monastash Creek after essentially about a century of being completely dried up. So, of course, we could have done better. We would have done better if we started in 1855 when the tribe signed its treaty, and the U.S. had respected that treaty, and the state of Washington had respected it. That didn't happen. Damage was done. The hand we were dealt starting 30, 40 years ago was on the order of 1% of the salmon runs remaining, the other 99% having been wiped out, and the only ones that existed were in that handful of habitats that were still available to them. And so it's been a long time goal for the Yakima Nation to restore passage into all those upper watersheds and restore habitat and also do some things for stream flow. So I've probably used my 5 minutes, and I will pass along to the next person here.
And that treaty started a war.
Yeah, that's right. The treaty didn't end the war, it started the war. If you want to read a really depressing book, Al Josephi wrote a book about the Nez Perce that covers treaty times. And in 1855, June 9th, the Yakima Nation signed its treaty. They were promised they would have some years to adapt and to move from where they were, and that nobody was going to come and kick them off their land. And Isaac Stevens raced to Portland and put in the newspaper 3 days later, open land available in eastern Washington, and and then there was a war.
So quickly, I forgot to introduce everybody. So I'll do that quickly. And then I'll ask my first question, then we can all add to the history of it as you see fit. So I'll start at the far end, Peter Dykstra. He is the lawyer in the contingent. I think you're the only lawyer who counsels public and private clients on water rights. This is super important for those of you who aren't familiar about water rights in the West. Land conservation transactions, ecosystem services markets. And he's an advisor to the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan. So he can give us the lawyerly perspective. And one thing I'd be interested in, if you want to speak to that, is my sense that lawyers like to negotiate rather than over interests and positions. And so I'd be interested in what you think about what I threw out with regard to beliefs. Next we have Urban Eberhardt. He's our farmer and a member of the Kittitas County Farm Bureau and elected to the Kittitas Reclamation District Board of Directors. So that's a special district. There are like 10, 20,000 special districts of various kinds in the US. And he's been on that since 1986. Wow. Yeah. involved in the Yakima Basin water planning since 1979. So there's a lot of history here, and it's important to keep track that there's a lot of these collaborative planning processes that have been going back a long time. So we're talking about the integrated plan here, but that's newer, and maybe one thing people want to speak to is how the integrated planning collaborative process might have looked a bit different. And then we have Bob Tuck, who's also who's worked for the Yakima Nation, which is super important because, as Tom pointed out, they have suffered the consequences of our water management over the years. He's done 3 decades of treaty rights work as well, and served as a management consultant for multiple agencies, including the Bureau of Reclamation. And Tom, he's our hydrologist and has worked with the Yakima Nation since 1990. Wow. Working on groundwater and surface water quantity and quality. So let me just ask my first question, and we'll start at the end. In what ways, well, actually, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't start with the water for this. How about if I start with urban?
I love questions.
I'm going to start with urban.
What is it?
So tell us how the collaborative process, and this is key, that we're focused on the collaborative process, changed your positions and beliefs. You want to talk about beliefs now, about what's going on in the basin. Like as a farmer, we're sure you have certain positions and you can describe them, but did the collaborative process change your positions, and did it change your beliefs?
So I need minutes. I need a wall. So how many minutes do I have?
I don't know. Iris, you can stop him, I don't know. 5, 10, sure.
He'll go on all night long if we don't have
Okay,
a
Iris.
I'll keep it.
Five,
I'll keep it short. I won't take all the time. Okay. So collaborative process. What's going on? How did it change my thinking and all of that sort of stuff? So again, my thinking all started, it evolved obviously from my parents and how I was raised and going through school and schooling. My dad taught at resource planning at the Central Washington University. So I was always engaged in what was going on, following him around to meetings. As I was growing up, I was fortunate enough to be able to run around and irrigate alfalfa and plant apple trees and plant pear trees and irrigate them. And we had one of the first drip irrigation systems in the Yakima Valley at our farm that was designed by Orchard Right. When they were actually doing that, it was really some really crude technology, but we were making it work. And the first time I ever even heard anything about if there was going to be like a water shortage or something, the kids on the school bus were talking about it in 1973, that there wasn't going to be any water that year. And I thought that's kind of funny, because everything I've always heard is there's always lots of water. And even then I knew that there was a lot of snow in the wintertime, and that as I found out later, the whole Columbia River system was operated for flood control for at least 3 decades because there was so much water. And that didn't really materialize that 73 year. We just got through it. And then in 1977, the United States Bureau of Reclamation told us we were going to have like 6% of our water supply that year. And that was quite shocking to me. By then I was in high school, and I had more responsibility, and my job was to keep those trees wet. And we were scrambling around, talking to the Department of Ecology. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We drilled a well, and then something really funny happened. The calculations weren't correct, and it turned out to be almost a 70% water year by the time we got to the end of the year, after causing all this havoc. But that's really what got us all started. We started this adjudication process, which, as Tom says, is still going on. And then that really kicked off this first phase of the Yakima Enhancement Project legislation, which we had been working on through the 1980s. And then 1994, we amended it with Congressman Inslee. And Bob was making those trips in the 80s back to Washington. We ended up back there together a few times. But we really weren't getting anywhere through the adjudication legal process, other than we got more certainty about what we had, but we were fighting like crazy with each other. When we would meet, all right, we would meet with 2 lawyers each, and we were fighting like crazy in federal court and state court, and we did a super job of tripping each other up, holding each other up, stalling everybody, but it wasn't solving the problem. It wasn't creating any new water, and it wasn't getting us new controls on water. So it wasn't making things better for agriculture, it wasn't making things better for industry or municipalities, and it certainly wasn't making things better for fish and wildlife. So we, skipping ahead to this collaborative process that we really started getting going on in earnest in 2009, that Tom was leading up to, we all decided collectively that, you know, this fighting is great. We all know how to do it. Everybody knows how to do that throughout the country. That's what everybody does. But we weren't getting anywhere. We weren't going to survive. And when we saw those droughts from that, you know, just a young kid, 73, what's going on? 77, uh-oh. And then pretty soon we started getting another one, and then another one, and then they were back to back, and then there were 3 years in a row. And it was pretty clear that something was going on at the same time we were doing all of this other stuff. So we needed to do something that was going to work to make us all survive. We got everybody together. The very first meetings were like every 2 weeks, and we sat around, and it was really trying to get everybody on the same plane, the same baseline, so that we had all the same information to make our decisions from. And we started right out saying, I started right out. We have an entitlement, and we're going to do everything we can to get that entitlement every year and leave my canals alone. And then we, you know, everybody was doing all of that, and then pretty soon we got to, after enough meetings, enough information, well, we can't really come up with that kind of water, and that's not really going to, we can't have a single purpose project. We need to have something that works for everybody. And then as we kept working it through and tried to come up with ideas and, well, what do you really need rather than what are your rights? And, well, yeah, those are still your rights, but what can you get by with? So we went to, well, okay, we don't need 100%. We'll try to get 70% of a supply. And then what do you need? Yakimas, what do you need, environmental folks, because we had a team of national environmental groups, Yakima Nation, just getting everybody together, state agencies, federal agencies, local governments. And really when we were coming up with all of these pieces of what everybody needed, then we were developing friendships. And then we were developing trust. And then these people that we were talking to before that were, they had those 2 lawyers with them, and we had our 2 or 4 lawyers with us, and we didn't have the lawyers in the room, except for sometimes those that were helping us, but not the other kind of lawyers. So just being able to interact, make friends, go drink some beer, go have dinner, go have lunch, whatever, and hang out. My views changed, that I went from, this is what we're going to do, we're going to do this, we're just going to do this one project and we'll have enough water and things will be great, to let's do a whole bunch of achievable, smaller projects and build as we go, show successes, have a ceremony, move on and do something else without going into specifics of what all those are. Going and finding funding, getting authorizations, getting appropriations, and doing it in a way that everybody wins. So we went totally from fighting like tooth and nail to trust, friendships, relationships. Our success is all because of that.
So this is a great place, I think. I'm going to go to Peter now to talk about going from this hyper lawsuits, fighting over positions, to the transformation where you're now apparently a friendly lawyer who helps.
Sure. So when I started in this work in 2009, I was what I was calling myself a recovering lawyer. I wasn't a lawyer anymore. I actually worked for the Trust for Public Land and then the Wilderness Society as a non-lawyer coming into this, and now I'm a lawyer again. So maybe that is how this process has affected me. I don't know. I'm joking. The collaborative process has change the way I think about these issues, and I want to talk about it in two different ways. One is within the environmental community, where I was a leader of two national organizations in the region as the idea of this integrated plan was emerging, and then I'll talk a little bit about it as a representative of a number of different environmental groups in the basin in my private practice. And I have to say, because I have clients, that these are my opinions and not those of any of my clients. When I was with the environmental community in a leadership role, there were a couple of partners that were deep into the collaborative negotiations. A leader at American Rivers, Michael Garrity, and a leader at the National Fish and Wildlife Federation, Steve Malik. The rest of the environmental community was not actually, the rest of the statewide environmental community, there were local groups, but the rest of the statewide and national groups weren't paying attention to it. But they had developed a negotiated concept around water and fish that they knew was going to be challenging for them to be able to engage their partners in the larger environmental community in the state if they committed to doing this. And so through their efforts and the efforts of Tom and his boss, Phil Rigdon, they recognized that in order to get support within the environmental community for this plan, they were going to have to reach out of the basin. And they came west of the mountains and tried to change hearts and minds within the environmental community about what the potential opportunities were through collaboration and cooperation in the Yakima Basin. That didn't happen overnight. We had a year in which those participants like Urban and Tom and the counties and others were trusting enough of that collaboration that they gave the larger environmental community time and resources to have its own collaborative discussion about whether the larger environmental community could come to support the tenets of the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan. We had facilitated conversations, we had arguments, we had fights, we had our own sort of collaborative process within that community. And what was really important is that we had that independently of the collaboration going on here, and there was enough trust of Steve and Michael and others to have that conversation with the possibility that more support would come to the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan. We didn't get all the way. One of the things I learned through that conversation is that no matter what community you're working in, full consensus is likely impossible and unnecessary. So we were able to deliver a significant amount of support and engagement in the integrated plan, but not all of it from the environmental community. And the willingness to then, based on that, take risk and step back into the plan and have some folks from the environmental community, but not all, say, yes, we want to go forward, knowing that others who are deep, long-term friends have real issues. We're going to have problems with that. We had to have the trust of this group and the vision for the future to move forward, notwithstanding our own constituency was going to continue to have arguments and challenges. The other thing that I learned is we came back into that plan, and there were about 13 national and statewide groups that decided we want to engage. As we came back into that work, and as I have represented them in my own practice right now, what I have learned and what I have found really important about the collaborative process is that the relationships and trust they've built here are so essential to them sustaining themselves when they continue to have conflict within their own community. So we've had a couple of occasions over the past 6 years, particularly when we get into moving federal or state legislation forward, where that fight within the environmental community reemerges. And the how dare you do this conversation comes up again. And the trust built in the collaboration here has sustained many of those groups to stay to their commitment to the plan, but it's gotten hard. And that the other piece, and I'll talk about this more later, I hope, is transition of individuals and evolution of staffing and organizations, and how collaboration can get weak when that happens.
So before getting to Bob, I just want to follow up on the trust issue that Urban and you referred to. Just very briefly, how do you define trust? What does trust actually mean?
Transparency and acceptance.
That other people, what they're doing, they're transparent and they're accepting your beliefs?
Whether they agree with them or not.
Urban?
I'll give you an example of what trust makes possible. So let's go back to 2015, which was that snowpack drought year. There wasn't any snow in the Cascade, very little snow in the Cascade Mountain Range. There wasn't much in the Olympic Mountain Range. And we had streams that were coming out of the mountains running into the Yakima River, multiple streams that were flowing at levels in late April and early May that they normally would be in late October because there wasn't snow sustaining them. And I was able to quickly get on the phone and call my friends, Tom's boss at the Yakima Nation, Phil, Dale Bambrick at the National Marine Fisheries Service, the folks at State Fish and Wildlife, Ecology, the Bureau of Reclamation, tipping off some of the environmental groups we were working with, and I said, I got this idea. How about if we work with the Yakimas? Tom approached us earlier. They'd been trying it earlier to get water out of the river, get it into tributaries. Tom started the conversation, and then I kept evolving on other ways that we could do it and get the irrigation district to accept it. So my idea was to get the irrigation guys to understand how good it would be for them. Tom was helping us work it through on his side, and we were able to quickly, within the matter of hours, in the case of Menashtash, when it started going subsurface, to get water, to get agreement, to get water, borrowed water, out of the river, up by Snoqualmie Pass, and carry it clear down and get it into a creek in Menashtash and save fish at that location. So it makes, trust makes it possible to react quickly with a very diverse group of people when 5 years ago they would have thought I was trying to pull something over on them.
Okay, let's turn to Bob now. You have a longer term perspective, perhaps, that precedes the Yakima Basin.
On. It's on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I can't even turn my computer on, so don't. So, what would we like to do? Long-term perspective?
Yeah, you have a long-term perspective on
Well, I
planning
don't
in
know.
the
Urban's got a pretty
Yakima.
long-term perspective.
But, so can you comment on how the integrated planning process as a collaborative process changed your positions, interests, beliefs?
Well, I'd like to back up a little bit,
Good.
since it's a long-term perspective. Urban and I go way back, almost 40 years. He and I used to sit on opposite sides of the courtrooms when back in the days when we really were in litigation. And so there's some members of the audience that are here this afternoon. We're doing the same things. So he and I remember what that was like, and we got the scars to prove it. By the late 80s, however, Urban and I were sitting on a panel, a group, that hammered out the language, as Urban mentioned, that was the successful attempt to get legislation, water legislation, passed by Congress in 1994. It's one of the only major water legislations or piece of water legislation that's passed Congress since World War II. So collaborative processes can work. I want to be real clear here. Number one, Urban deserves a ton of credit for doing what he's doing up in the Kittitas Valley. He was just giving me, just before we started, a quick update. I've been following it, but there's a number of creeks in the Kittitas Valley that have been dried up for more than 100 years that he is keeping. It's not working? Really?
It's on.
Is it on?
Talk.
Talk.
There you go.
Well, I don't know. Nobody raised their hand and said it wasn't on. Just a ton of credit for doing what they can using the infrastructure that they have to bring fish back to those creeks. That has been a long-term goal of the Yakima Nation, and one of the things that bugged me when I first started in this basin 40 years ago was all these creeks, not only up there, but some other areas that still haven't been addressed, that dried up in the spring and summer. Fish can't go up and down, so they're essentially out of production. That's the kind of thing that he is leading the way on to do. I also want to be real clear when we talk about the integrated plan that my comments are not a blanket comments, not blanket comments. To the extent that there is fish passage in the IP, I mean, I spent most of my career on fish passage working for the tribe. I'm all for that. It's a dream come true. My comments will be pretty much limited to two areas. One, the storage components, and two, the projections for returning sockeye adults that are contained in the IP. I have to take a little bit of disagreement with Peter on the environmental community's involvement in the collaborative process. And this is fairly serious, and that is that not all the environmental community is there. And I'm not at all criticizing the effort to get as many there as we can, but they're not all there. And if you don't have essential members at the table, you don't, as I think about it, get your severest critic. You want them at the table, because if he signs in or she signs in, then at the end of the process, you've got buy-in by the person or the organization that was going to be your severest critic. That didn't happen. And now we've got organizations and individuals out there on the outside that have attorneys that are sharpening their pencils, so that when the Bureau of Reclamation makes a decision to proceed, assuming they do, with some of these storage elements, we all know what's going to happen. And that, I think, is unfortunate. It's going to delay things, it's going to cost money, and all sorts of things that happen when you get into litigation. And so collaborative efforts can work. We're living examples of that. Hammered out that language, and I can tell you, man, we hammered and hammered on it to get it to something that both the irrigation district, the tribe, and the environmental groups were at the table, that we all could agree with. And George Miller. It's tough. I am not saying it is not tough. It is tough. And I'm not faulting the people that spent the time and the effort and their energies to try to push this forward. They deserve a lot of credit. But I think we need a reality check. And that's basically, I think, what I'd like to leave it at, and we'll pick it up later.
Okay, so Peter or Bob or whomever maybe can pick it up later as to why some of those environmental groups weren't joining in. You could speak to that now, perhaps, or we could go to Tom.
Yeah, I can't speak to why they haven't joined in, but I can say that there was a concerted effort to invite all of them to the table. I had hosted series of meetings where we had 70 people representing almost every environmental organization that we could think of in the Wilderness Society's offices, where it was very clear that there were members of the environmental community we're not going to support. We did our best to create the space outside of the integrated plan table to have that conversation. And we did not get everybody there, and I hope I didn't convey that there were all of the environmental organizations supported the integrated plan. It's clearly not the case, and I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that I think that that is true, or that the views, values, and beliefs of those groups that are not supportive of the plan are not legitimate views and values. They just were not where at least 15 groups got themselves and wanted to continue. The lawyer one is an interesting one because at one of the early conversations, one of the lawyers who is an incredibly talented lawyer in sharpening his pencil and has done great things for the environment all over the state, was at the table, and he left the table because he knew that he was not going to be able to get to yes and would eventually be in a position of having to probably sharpen his pencil to do litigation. And he was transparent about that when he left the table. I know that those who will potentially litigate some of the issues, I'm not a litigator, as a lawyer, I do deals, so I will not have to deal with that. But he was transparent in why he would leave and the role that he sees himself playing. And from my perspective, that's why I said transparency and acceptance are so important, because if you can be transparent and accept even somebody who you disagrees with views for having them, and be willing to continue moving on, knowing you're going to have future disagreement, we're going to have that. And I don't think there is a collaborative process that will satisfy everybody. And I actually think that people who are not in the collaborative processes articulating concerns with the process and the substance going on there help make those collaborative processes better. And I don't think that even though they're not there, that's a reason to stop doing collaborative process.
Okay, Tom, your turn.
Yeah, thanks. Consensus certainly doesn't mean unanimity, and we would never pretend that that is the truth. The way I remember the discussions that Peter was talking about, the question was basically asked of the environmental organizations, can you live with additional reservoir storage in the Yakima Basin that would benefit irrigated agriculture and benefit in-stream flow if the package includes fish passage, a large acquisition of privately owned forest land that was slated for development in the Teanaway, a number of other things that were environmentally beneficial, and some said yes and some said no. So there are some people who I believe, I don't want to speak for them, but I think are unalterably opposed to any additional reservoir storage for agriculture, and there are some other people who are unalterably opposed to reservoir storage in certain places that they find dear to them. From my perspective, the problem is that the environmental status quo is an atrocity. It is not something to defend. Even some of these places that people find dear are places that were degraded by building reservoirs there and blocking fish passage and all the other things. So that is basically the way I remember that split occurring. On the other side, I just kind of wanted to double back your question about trust and how to build trust. I don't think that where we are came from renting the Arboretum and getting a bunch of people sitting around a table sharing their ideas. We'd been doing that for decades. It wasn't happening. I think there are a lot of different sort of creation myths about the integrated plan, and I have my own, and it started in a parking lot on a really cold winter day in a conversation with the guy whose picture I showed there. There was a kind of competing proposal for dealing with the Yakima Basin that involved pumping water 1,500 vertical feet out of the Columbia River up to a $7 billion reservoir that would be built on the ridge between the Columbia and Yakima rivers, and that would then provide an additional 1 million acre feet of water supply. The irrigators had looked at that in years past, had done the math, they'd said that doesn't pencil out. The Bureau of Reclamation was busy spending $19 million studying that proposal, and Ron Van Gundy, who was not in great health and I think was realizing that if he didn't change the paradigm soon, he wasn't going to have a chance. He pulled a couple tribal staff people out and said, okay, what are we going to do about this? And the conversation led to a letter that was written by the chairman of the board of the Rose Irrigation District and the chairman of the Yakima Tribal Council on Yakima Nation letterhead that said, we, the Yakima Nation and Rose Irrigation District, believe this is what we should do to fix the Yakima Basin. And that was news. You know, the reporters started calling like, okay, this, you got the word we in there, and you got these signatures on this same letter. How did that happen? And I think it happened out of a deep sense of frustration and exhaustion in both the physical sense but also the legal sense. The attempts to annihilate each other had failed, and we were going to finish this adjudication, and the junior irrigators weren't going to have enough water, and the tribe wasn't going to have what it needed for fish. And so to me, that was sort of the kernel. And then the Department of Ecology, the Bureau of Reclamation said, with regard to this letter, well, that's fine. It's all good and well, but we were told by Congress to study Black Rock, the reservoir proposal, so that's what we're going to do. Derek Sandison, who was at the Department of Ecology at the time, and he's now the Director of Agriculture for Washington State, said, well, Congress can't tell me what to do, so I'm going to get kind of a friendly divorce from Reclamation here, and we're going to do a supplemental environmental impact statement on this alternative that was essentially posed in this letter from the tribe and Rosa. That was done. Reclamation got in the game and did a basin study, convened the work group. The work group spent a year refining this proposal, but I think it really took the sort of worst adversaries looking each other in the eye and saying, okay, what do you want, and what do you want, and okay, I can live with what you want if you can live with what I want. And that's how I have come to define compromise. Because for tribes, compromise has usually meant, okay, we could take everything you have, so if we only take half of what you have, that's a compromise. It's like we're giving you half because we didn't take it all. A compromise in the form of, okay, I accept your goal. In this case, for the irrigators, it was fairly simple. It was getting the proratable irrigators up to 70%, which is, albeit a multi-billion-dollar goal, it's kind of a modest proposal. They weren't trying to get 100%. They weren't trying to put another 100,000 acres into production. They were just trying to take existing irrigated ag and make it sustainable in the long run. And the tribe, of course, wanted some of the things I was talking about earlier. But I think that was sort of how the trust started. The attitude toward fish passage 20 years ago was, over my dead body, will there ever be fish passage at any of our reservoirs, from the Bureau of Reclamation. And of course, you know, when somebody says over my dead body, I think, well, if those are your terms, I guess we can negotiate, but fortunately, nobody had to die. The Bureau had to change. The irrigators who in the late 90s sued to stop fish passage at Catchless Reservoir, which had to be replaced because it was at risk of a dam failure, they are now full-throated in support of restoring fish passage at all the reservoirs. And so, you know, there's a really bad old joke, the punchline of which is, you know, someone gets offered their 3 wishes from the genie, and one of the wishes is, I want you to kill my neighbor's goat. And I think we had to get to the point where our goals were no longer, I want to kill my neighbor's goat, to like, okay, here's what I want, and here's what you want. Some mutual respect in that fashion.
May I?
Yeah, quickly.
Okay, real quickly, if I can. I'll try.
Are you
Okay,
capable of
so we have some really good partners, like just not leaving anybody out, but like American Rivers and Trout Unlimited and other groups that we're working with. And one of the things that we've been able to do here in this basin with this plan is find a way to do something that's really unlike anything else in the United States that we've been able to find. So the example would be, as Bob was mentioning, where we're utilizing this existing infrastructure to, for actually purposes other than what it was originally constructed, finding room to carry water in these canal systems, take it out away from the river, find ways to implement groundwater storage. Tom's on the chair of the groundwater committee of the integrated plan. We'll be using these very large distribution systems to run at times of the year when they wouldn't normally be running, to take water to pretty good size surface storage reservoirs, to get control of that rainwater that'll be coming in the winter when it's not snow. So we're helping fish and wildlife, we're regrowing plants, we're regrowing trees. And one of the ways that we're able to do it successfully is by using the infrastructure that is already there, finding a way to do it, and doing it cooperatively. So what we are doing is so good for the environment, but it's also so good for agriculture and municipalities. And it's really a collaborative effort that is possible because we found a way to have the trust, to create the relationships, to have the friendships, to take a system that was constructed, designed in the late 1800s, constructed in the early 1900s, and use it for what it was designed for, but also fish and wildlife.
I had one little
And then I'll
point.
open it to questions from the audience.
Just one. I characterized 2 styles of opposition, the principle-based and the place-based. There is a third there, and I want to say this out of respect for some people in this room who I think fall in this category. There's some people who are opposed to it because they don't think it'll work. They either think that we need a whole lot more water than we can ever get by storing Yakima River water, or they don't think it'll be effective. So we think it will. We think it's the best package that we could put together to fix the problems for water supply as water supply dwindles due to climate change. And as you could see from the fish picture, certainly getting fish into the best habitat in the basin is obviously a no-brainer. But I think there's a third category of people who are opposed to the integrated plan, and it's based on they don't think it'll be effective.
And that's what I was referring to, beliefs, cause and effect beliefs. Questions from the audience now?
My name's Miles McCready. I'm here in Washington for the development of the integrated plans. It's probably about 2012. I've gone to a lot of these meetings. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to pose to the panel. And also, if you'll humor me, let me say a little bit about them. The first one is, I think there are probably 3 aspects of climate change that are really important in the 100-year time span. Okay. So in the 100-year time span of the integrated plan, the first of those would be the snowpack storage, which is important and which has been touted in the integrated plan. as a big reason for having this. But the second would be the impact of climate change on agricultural practices, which I think is quite important. And finally, the third is on water temperatures. And I think the major second question that I would ask the panel to address is why a large reservoir in the Bumping Basin, which doesn't make economic sense and destroys a wonderful old-growth ecosystem. So if I can have a few minutes, I'll talk about the first. Urban mentioned 2015. In 2015, okay, first I should say a little bit about myself, okay? I graduated from Stanford. That was pretty good preparation for pursuing a degree in geophysical fluid dynamics at the University of Washington, which then led into a 4-decade career studying ice-ocean interaction in polar regions. As far as I know, I'm the only polar oceanographer in the Yakima Valley. So from that, that is where the Arctic is ground zero for global warming. We were observing it. We knew it was happening. This isn't one of these things you have a belief in. This is just something you see. And one of the things that we found is that you know, it's a complicated system, and climate change varies in many different ways over that system. I've been talking about this to groups in the Yakima Valley since the mid-90s because that's when we were really starting to see it. So I guess I was kind of gratified that some of the farmers were actually believing that the snowpack would be less because of global warming. But to get back to the issue at hand, in 2015, that was almost like, you know, a scientific control experiment. Okay, we had this winter where the snow fell as rain, so there was no snowpack. Then in June, July, August, the average temperature at the Yakima Airport was about 7 degrees Fahrenheit above the climatological 30 years from 51 to 80, okay, or to 2010. So what impact that had was yes, there were severe water shortages in the prorated or junior water rights in the Yakima Valley. But what you saw in the upper valley was orchards with senior water rights, day after day, all day, sprinkling their orchards to prevent sunburn on the apples, or prevent heat damage. So you had this kind of juxtaposition of the A water, or the senior water rights, using all they could because they wanted to bring in a big crop, and perhaps not thinking, or I'm sure they were thinking, that, oh good, the Rosa won't bring in the crops that they would have, the prices will be better. That is a major problem with water rights in the Yakima Valley. But then we come to the second problem, and this is a really big one.
Can you pose question, because we want to allow time for everybody. Can you pose a question for the
all
panel?
right. The second question has to do with water in the tributaries of the Columbia. So Bob made some allusion to it, but that summer at Sunnyside Dam, or I'm sorry, Prosser Dam, for something like 20 days, the water was above temperatures that sockeye salmon will migrate under. Okay, so sockeye salmon require a temperature of less than 7 degrees Fahrenheit to move. They didn't move. They expected 5,000 or 6,000 fish at Prosser. They got like 350. Okay, so if 2015 portends what global warming will do to the Yakima Valley, and these are not unreasonable at all, that we will see those kind of temperatures within a couple of decades, that says that the fish migrations will be small. And the reason that that works into the integrated plan is that almost 80% of the benefit of, for the plan comes from the non-use or I guess, non-use value. That is, people placing the value on what they would like to spend to see fish come back to that basin. 80% of the benefit depends on having those huge fish runs come back. It's not going to happen unless the fish can evolve fast enough to swim up rivers that are above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So the climate issue is one that the integrated plan has basically kind of ignored, except for the snow storage. I think I can give up the mic.
Let's put this to the audience, to the panel now. So what do you have to say then about the plan dealing with climate change?
I would like to take that, and I probably don't really need a microphone. I appreciate what we just heard. Obviously, the effect on flow and water supply is premised on the idea that we're going to have more rain, less snow, and earlier, faster runoff. And one way to deal with water leaving the upper watersheds more rapidly is to store more water in them. In terms of temperature, it's not actually correct that we're ignoring everything but flow. The Yakima Basin has always been a desert. It has always been a hot, dry place, and it produced upwards of 1 million returning salmon. And we think it did that because a healthy, functioning watershed stores early season cold water in the floodplains, in wetlands, in side channels, and that water discharges as cool groundwater discharge later in the season, and that the fish in this basin evolved to take advantage of those thermal refugia is the buzzword for them. And so a very major component of the habitat component of the integrated plan is floodplain reconnection, side channel reconnection, woody debris in streams so that they will go over bank and store that water. Because we think with or without climate change, the basin itself was so thoroughly degraded by roads, railroads, highways, dikes, drains, things like that, that it had become extremely inhospitable for fish. So it probably, and the mean annual air temperature, driving water temperature, was always too high for salmon in the lower Yakima, but there were these watershed mechanisms in place to moderate temperature, at least in these patches that the fish needed, and that's what we're working on restoring, beginning at the very bottom of the Yakima Basin, where there is an island where a causeway was built out to the island, and it blocks off most of the flow of the Yakima River and confines it to a little channel on the side, and it gets lethally hot for fish there, and they sit in the Columbia, and they won't come up into the Yakima because of it. So that's another of the 7 components of the integrated plan, is working on those watershed functions to deal with temperature as well as flow.
Anybody else want to comment on climate?
No, we can get on to the other questions. There's a lot of hands.
Is this on this time?
Yes.
Okay. There are 2,000-pound gorillas in the Yakima Basin. Not 1, 2. One is climate change. The other one is the lower 100 miles of the Yakima River. With respect, as Tom mentioned, it has been altered, the flow's been altered, the temperatures have been altered, and it is highly problematic for salmon, both juveniles to go down and adults to come up, and we have a 2015. What wasn't mentioned in 2015, it wasn't just the Yakima that saw lethal temperatures. The Columbia and the Snake both had lethal temperatures for sockeye, and we lost approximately 80% of all sockeye, which was a good run that year, died. So if the projections that I've seen from UW Climatological Center and their models, and as was just mentioned, if 2015 happens just once every 7 or 8 years, the talk of having 300,000 sockeye coming back to the Yakima Basin. And I can sit here and I can be complimentary to Urban and to everybody else here, but this is one, as a fish biologist, I feel very strongly about. The idea that you're going to have 300,000 sockeye coming back is fantasy. It is just pure fantasy. At least in human lifetimes. Maybe in geologic, when we have another ice age that cleans everything out, then the only one to be around to see that will be Urban.
That's right.
But in terms of ameliorating the lower 100 miles to make it conducive habitat remember, we're talking about summer. We're talking about the teeth of the summer. To having that kind of numbers come back, as a fish biologist, I have seen nothing substance that even remotely suggests that is possible. And I said that we had 2 gorillas in the room in the lower 100 miles. We have so altered that ecosystem that we have made it wonderful habitat for everything that eats salmon smolts. Smallmouth bass, walleye, catfish, all of which are introduced species, and the native northern pike. So what we do, and I give full credit to Urban, but what we're doing in reality in the fish world is we're producing the smolts in the upper river, and he's opening a lot of habitat up there, and so will the passage, and we're bringing them down this giant conveyor belt, and we're delivering them to the doorstep, just like the ads talk about bringing food to your doorstep, to the smallmouth bass and the catfish and the other predators down there. And they're coming out, and there's data from the fish agencies themselves. How many smallmouth bass? Somewhere in the year that they did the research, 25 to 35,000. How many smolts, just fall Chinook? How many fall Chinook smolts are they eating per day? 16,000. Now what do you suppose is going to happen if we put 1 million same size sockeye smolts back down there? In the teeth of climate change. Warmer temperatures, metabolism of the predators goes up. You can see how this gets into a vicious circle. If you don't address the lower river, not just nibble around the edges, and I'm not disagreeing with Tom, we should do that, but that doesn't solve your ecosystem problem. You've got 100 miles to solve. And as long as you've got hundreds of thousands of predators down there chomping on the smolts coming down, there is no way that that's a realistic number.
Okay, so just second, Martha, please. So I'm a real optimist, and the good news is that we have a Lower Rivers subcommittee, and we're working with the Yakima Nation on getting water into the ground. We'll be working that, we'll be getting that temperature down in the lower part of the river with a lot of our groundwater storage work out on the Yakima and other places. So it's not that dire. Martha.
So I think we have a perfect example of what this conference is about in collaboration and compromise. And Miles, your series of positions that you elaborated on are difficult ones. And I am making an assumption that there's old, long, deep history between all of you. And that helps for collaborating and compromising, I would like to believe. But I think Peter's comment early on is, what happens when 2 of the 4 of you, or a portion of the whole trust and work together committees of the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan do decide to step aside? How are you mentoring, and how are you developing the new inroads for making collaboration and compromise go forward? I've completely drunk the Kool-Aid on this entity. And the reason is that it has spun off all sorts of other dynamic activities that are actually good for the environment, good for the economy. There is a phenomenal project going on where there's rehab using tribal Yakima Nation resources to restore a wetland. And I mean, there's really exciting things that are completely aside. They're becoming the fundamentals of the next steps. But how do you carry that forward? I think, Peter, that was a really important point to make. Thank you.
Maybe I'll start. We work hard at it and try and be deliberate about it, and try and think through how it is that we can empower not just individuals but organizations in the participation of it. So there are various different components of the integrated plan, and we try not to centralize them on individuals and use existing organizations to do pieces of that. So to the extent that a state agency or an environmental nonprofit has a leader who sits on the work group or sits on the executive committee, we try and have other staff who, in the best of all worlds, will be the future leaders of those organizations, participate in pieces of the plan so they really build their own relationships across the fairly significant network we have and understand that culture and history and bring their own views, beliefs, and influences into that. But we can't control all of that. I've now had 3 jobs since I started working on the Yakima Integrated Plan, so I'm as much of a problem on this issue as anyone is. And some of the organizations that I led have shifted in national focus. And so it's how do we keep them as involved as they can be, but accepting that their funding may change, that their DC headquarters may change the mission of the organization, and think through who else can step into that role. And I think one of the great things, and Urban and Tom, we talk about this a lot, we can tell each other's stories now. We've been doing this so long. The trick is to make sure that in addition to telling our stories, there are pieces of the work that other organizations can do. So you've heard a lot from Bob that Urban's doing half of the work of Trout Unlimited, and he's still partnering with them, but 5 years ago, it was all a Trout Unlimited project manager trying to figure that out. They're doing it in partnership. The biggest challenge that I see is that in addition to institutions who get to make choices by making hiring decisions of who participates in this, we have political entities that sit at the table in the work group, in the executive committee, and elsewhere. We are about to face the transition of the 2 county commissioners that have been at the heart and soul of this over the last 8 years. They're transitioning out of that elected role by choice, but they don't get to decide who's going to come after them. And so it's about building the networks and relationships. Commissioner Jewell from Kittitas County has announced he's leaving. Commissioner Leda has said, I'm probably not going to be around for a long time. We'll see how Commissioner Jewell, because his transition is very recently public, but we've watched Commissioner Leda try and bring other local government leadership into the work group in a very deliberate way well before he makes that transition. So we can't control what the politics might bring. No one should be surprised by that, given the state of the country right now. But so that's the place in which I think it's going to be most challenging, is how do we keep that sort of elected leadership who can come in with a vast range of policy ideas they want to focus on. We just were blessed with 2 that really thought water was the critical one right now. I think it probably will be at the top of anyone's list in those 2 counties, but how they choose to spend their time is up to them, and we're going to have to build towards that.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I think it's on. Just getting to what one of the points Craig made right at the beginning, and to what Peter just said. This is a wonderful recounting of a successful collaboration and how long it took. I have a story back from when I was a reporter of something that might have been a successful collaboration and was squelched. It was something told me by a friend who worked for a national organization in northern Montana, but it was talking as a friend, so I can't go into too much detail about the organization. But the issue was grizzlies, and the issue was what to do about protecting grizzlies in the Northern Rockies. And the issue was dealing with hunters who wanted to kill grizzlies for lots of good reasons. They didn't want the grizzlies to kill their kids. The local, from an environmental group, had worked for a long time with people from the hunter groups and had come to a collaborative solution for when you could hunt, when you couldn't hunt, what, you know, all the things that were needed to make sure that the grizzlies' DNA kept going, but to make sure the hunters were able to do what they needed to protect people. Long story short, the local guy, my friend called, I'm going to call him, I don't even know his name, but I'm going to call him Joe. Somebody who was at middle level in the national office in Washington who got really excited about the collaboration and how this had been a long-standing fight and they'd figured out an answer. And he said, I'm going to tell our PR people about this and we're going to come out and do a film on you. And this is the kind of thing our organization should be doing. And then time passed and he didn't get much more callbacks. And so he called back and said, hey, Joe, what happened to that film? And Joe hemmed and hawed and then said, well, when we talked to the board, we realized that we wouldn't be able to raise money if it was clear that we had dealt with these guys we'd been painting as the bad guys for all these years. And so the economics of the organization meant that collaboration would undercut their economics, and they would lose big funders who loved grizzlies so much and hated hunters. So the question for Peter is, obviously you're nodding, you must have run across something like this more than once. How do you, part of what you're trying to deal with in collaborative governance is NGOs, what do you do about the beliefs of the funders of the NGOs? You can deal with the beliefs of the actual representatives on the ground, as Craig talked about, but they have to deal with the beliefs of their funders.
Yeah, great question, and a huge challenge. And what I would say is, you can have even the same funders who buy into an organization participating in collaboration, but if collaboration doesn't happen with demonstrable results in year 1 or year 2, that funder could leave even within that time without a shift in their belief system, et cetera. And so part of that, I think, is making sure that you're clear about what the collaboration is bringing, that the collaboration has milestones that everybody can show are milestones that meet the beliefs and values of their funders, their citizens who elect them, et cetera. And I think Urban and Tom and others have probably learned more about the challenging dynamics of funding environmental NGOs than they ever thought they would have. And so we have to find new funding partnerships. We need to, you know, some of the outreach that is done through the environmental organizations is funded by the counties and the irrigation districts and others. So we look for solutions by being transparent about the problems as we go through it. And then if somebody leaves, understanding that they are not leaving because they no longer believe in the efforts going on, but we be accepting that there are some things we just cannot control.
You actually raise a really good point, because nonprofit funding is very fickle, and collaborative efforts that have to deal with these long-term building up of trust relationships and changing beliefs takes a long time. And I tend to believe government should be seeding these partnerships more than nonprofits.
So on that, one of the things that I am doing and constantly focusing on is looking for projects that are so good that that can be achieved affordably, quickly, and have biggest bang for the buck, great successes that we can do on the irrigation side, and the NGOs can then say, look at what they're doing, and look what they're doing because we're working with them, and look what we're doing together, and so that we can encourage those that are helping, the funders that are helping us. We can encourage them by saying, look at those are just be dry rocks and dead trees, and now there are insects growing, and there are fish swimming in there, and they're going up to the cooler water, and guess what? The farmers are still getting their water.
So given that we have Stanford here, I've got something that has been in my mind. We have heard a lot, maybe some of you have, I know Urban has, a lot about public-private partnerships in the infrastructure funding space. I would really love to see somebody explore public-private partnerships in the funding of NGO space.
Just quickly, Iris, how much time is there? Or almost done? Okay, one last question maybe from Phil.
Question. You know the words OKRs? I just heard them last week. Objectives, key results. That's what makes either not-for-profits or businesses work. So when you think about it, simplicity and elegance gives you a lot of fathers and a lot of dialogue. If you come up with a collective group of objectives that people agree on, or you can even stack them. This is the ones we agree on, this is the ones we don't agree. Let's go to the middle, and these are the key results and the timelines on it. And all of a sudden, people feel much more that they're engaged in the process of the OKRs. There's another word too, which I'm missing on KIAs, but OKRs is the big thing out of Silicon Valley on whether you invest or you don't invest either on a charitable event or on a startup new venture group.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that term before. I think that's great. One of the tricks with that, though, and I think one of the values of the plan that we have here is we have laid those out over 30 years. And we have broken them down into phases to move through them. But we will often hear criticism of something that's 20 years out that we're not even really working on right now as the reason not to do anything in the first phase of those. So one of the challenges is how do you sort of identify big enough key results to move a 30-year plan, but not get yourself trying to defend something that you're not even exploring yet. And if you're a learning organization or a learning effort like the integrated plan is, maybe we won't get there, maybe we will, something will change, but we can't have that argument right now. So you've got to be very careful about how you lay those aspirations out in a way that something that's far enough down the road doesn't absorb all of your time defending right now.
3 words in that, but communicate, communicate, communicate. If you don't do that, then all the other stuff is BS.
Loud and clear.
So we have 30 to 40 years of experience shared with us, and want to thank you for all your hard work. And it's very clear from the discussion how much emotional labor there is in developing these relationships. Thank you.